Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have you here this afternoon at the Phoenix Art Museum. My name is Jeremy Mikulazak, and I'm the Sybil Harrington Director and CEO here at Phoenix Art Museum. And on behalf of the board, staff, and our volunteers, I am very excited to welcome you to hear from artist Amalia Mesa-Bains, whose major career retrospective, Amalia Mesa-Bains' Archaeology of Memory, is now on view in the Steele Gallery. Today, we are in for an incredible conversation, and we are witnessing history in real time with these three incredible artists, historians, museum professionals here today from various aspects of the art world and, of course, history and time and everything else. So it is truly going to be special. Amalia is joined today by Susana Torruella Leval, the Director Emerita of El Museo del Barrio in New York, and exhibition co-curator Dr. Laura Pérez, who is the head of the Latinx Research Center at UC Berkeley. Before I officially introduce our guests today, I'd like to first thank, of course, our museum members who are in attendance today. It is through your foundational support and all in basically what membership support here at the museum is that it is critical funding that helps us support operations, exhibitions, and of course, education and engagement programs like today's talk. Thank you for believing in the museum, and thank you for believing in us and for supporting everything that we do here at the museum. So thank you for that. Also, I'd like to give just a quick recognition to Milena Antonia Storga, who have generously sponsored not only this program of today, but also all the arts-related programming throughout the run of the exhibition. And if you haven't received a copy of the incredible calendar that we have of just all the events that are happening throughout the run of the exhibition into the spring, please make sure you pick one up on your way out. And thanks to Tony and Milena for their support in this. Let's give them a round of applause. Lastly, I just want to say and express gratitude to all the individuals and organizations who have helped make this exhibition and, of course, the program today possible. We would not be here today without the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, who organized this incredible exhibition and collaboration with the Latinx Research Center at UC Berkeley. And we want to thank the exhibition sponsors who also made this possible, including the Henry Luce Foundation, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and here in Phoenix, the Virginia G. Piper Charitable Trust Exhibition Endowment Fund. In addition to that, we also want to thank the support of the O'Patterney Family Foundation and Joan Kremen. And lastly, of course, we want to thank those community partners, including the Kimpton Hotel Palomar, who has been with us for the last year and supporting us by providing rooms and services, of course, to all the guests that we bring in. So let's give them another round of applause. So without further ado, I know you're not here to listen to me speak, you're here to listen to these incredible speakers that we have here with us. It is my esteemed honor to introduce Amalia Mesa-Bains as an artist, activist, educator, and scholar who explores the experiences, spiritual practices, and histories of Mexican-American women. In the mid-1970s, Mesa-Bains began innovating with sacred forms rooted in Mexican indigenous traditions of honoring familial histories and ancestors. These signature works, inspired by home altars, ofrendas, also honor the memories of the artist's cultural predecessors, including Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, Frida Kahlo, and other women whose lives defied societal norms and expectations. Over time, Mesa-Bains expanded her practice to explore public environments such as laboratories, libraries, gardens, and landscapes. Her collective body of work stands as an archaeological examination into the politics of space, highlighting the complexities of domestic life for immigrant and Mexican-American women and exploring the ways colonial narratives erase Mexican, African-American, and indigenous identities. Mesa-Bains has certainly blazed a trail bringing feminist and Chicana art to wider global audiences and carving a place for it more broadly within the history of contemporary American art. Let's give a round of applause and welcome Amalia. We are also joined today in this conversation with Susana Torruella Leval, Director Emerita and former Chief Curator of El Museo del Barrio, the nation's leading Puerto Rican, Latinx, and Latin American museum. Leval has worked as an art writer and curator of Puerto Rican, Latinx, and Latin American contemporary art in New York City since 1970. She received a Bachelor of Arts degree in art history from the Manhattanville College and completed her MA and doctoral work at NYU's Institute of Fine Arts. She has also been a recipient of Hunter College's President's Medal for the Arts and was awarded an honorary doctorate from Pace University. Let's give a warm welcome to Susana. And finally, but certainly not least, is our incredible co-curator of this amazing exhibition. Moderating today's conversation is Dr. Laura Pérez, Professor of Chicanx, Latinx, and Ethnic Studies, and the Chair of the Latinx Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Pérez has authored numerous publications that explore the aesthetics of Chicana art and the intersections between art, spirituality, and decolonization, among many other topics. With Maria Esther Fernandez, Dr. Pérez co-curated Amalia Mesa-Bains' Archaeology of Memory and co-edited the exhibition's accompanying catalog. She received her PhD at Harvard University and a BA-MA joint degree from the University of Chicago. Please, let's give a warm welcome for all of our guests today, and looking forward to it. So I will turn it over to you, Dr. Pérez.
Great, thank you so much, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today and in the company of these two outstanding women who are witnesses to the foundation of art centers and museums and research projects that allowed for the survival, I would say, of U.S. Latinx art on the East Coast and on the West Coast. And so this conversation is truly historical, as it was characterized earlier. And today what we were hoping to do is to listen to these two amazing women, these two amazing trailblazers, and to think about some of the connections between the East Coast and the West Coast Latinx communities, looking for parallels, looking for the moments of intersection between these two women that have characterized this conversation as a conversación entre comadres, a conversation among good friends. And they are certainly comadres in the spirit-blessed project of midwifing and protecting the arts, especially the arts of the U.S. Latinx community, given this context of tremendous inequity in visibilization that their labors in the company of their peers helped to transform. And so we want to hear from them, and we will be showing you slides of other artists along with the work of Amalia Mesa-Bains, and we'll be, we hope to also be touching on, maybe to begin with, and the image that's up helps us to do this, to really thinking about like how generative it was for Amalia to visit many times on the East Coast, where some of her most important exhibitions happened both in New York City and outside of New York City, and then to also perhaps end by being able to see how the inspiration and the infusion into Amalia's life and into her art comes full circle when we look at more recent art exhibitions happening on the East Coast. And so maybe one of the things that, we have this image up here, which is from Venus NV4, which is the road to Pérez and its aftermath, the Botanica, which you can all see if you haven't had a chance to see in this exhibition, and 2008. And it's one of the pieces. There are others, but it's certainly one of the pieces where the flow of Latinx, vibrancy on the East Coast enters into Amalia's life. And so maybe we could begin, by talking about that experience of going to the East Coast, Amalia, and your contacts with Susana and other artists.
Can you hear me? Okay, I wanted to profess this, at least really acknowledge how important Susana's friendship has been to me over the years. I started going to New York in the mid to late 80s and met many artists. One of them was a young man named Juan Bosa, who is no longer with us. And in this Curanderas Botanica, there are great influences from him. When I first got there as a Chicana, I didn't really know very much about Afro-Latino diasporic work. I knew a little bit about Puerto Rico because the Brown Berets and the Puerto Rican lords had some connections. I knew that Puerto Ricans, Chicanos were probably the two biggest groups that had a very well-known social struggle in the U.S. But beyond that, I really didn't know more about it. I met Juan Bosa, who was Cuban, came in the Marielitos boat lift, and he took me to my first big botanica. And I must say that I was absolutely stunned. Within the Mexicano community, we have botanicas and we have materials that have to do with healing. So I want to say that this piece was about curanderismo, or the healing tradition, the inseparability of the mind and the body, the connection between the living and the dead, and cures that are collective, not individual, and the role that nature plays in those organic materials. But when I saw Juan's botanic, I realized we had never reached that level. It was complex. It was just almost on the level of what others might call magic. It was so profound. And he became a very close friend of mine. And I want to say, too, that in that period of time, I began to see both the affinities and the differences between Chicano art and Latino art. And Chicano art, in my perception at that time, came out of an experience in the United States that was sort of hidden. There was discrimination, but it wasn't named that because we lived under the illusion in this country that there was equality. It's one of our founding concepts. Well, the Latin Americans that I met had come out of dictatorships. And so they had a very overt system of political oppression. And so their works were very covert. They were subtle and sort of below the surface. We had a covert experience, so our works were overt. You can see when we show some of the works, a higher kind of palette, more direct political messaging. And so those were the things that began to happen for me. And there were different translations. When I met Susana at Museo, and I think that was toward maybe the early 90s, late 80s, I was also having my first solo show in New York with Inverna Lopez at Intar, and it was called Grotto of the Virgins. And I often people ask me, well, do you see the turning points in your career? And I said, yes, one of them is the show I did at Intar. You don't exist in the art world in those days unless you were in New York. And my show, Grotto of the Virgins, was listed in Art in America as one of the 10 best solo shows in alternative space. That opened the door for so many more opportunities that I would never have had if I was just showing in California. So I think of the women, and we'll talk about them later, Inverna Lopez at Intar, Nilda Perazas at Mocha, Susana at Museo del Barrio. There were so many people that I feel like opened doors for me and helped me to move forward. So that's really part of it. It wasn't just changing my aesthetic or opening my eyes to different kinds of political meaning, but it was also the companionship, the comadres that I met in those days that helped me to move along in my own work. Maybe Susana wants to talk about those times a bit too.
Well, my voice. Is this on? First and foremost, a salute to Amalia, la maestra. I idolized her from the opposite coast my entire life. So this panel sitting next to you is like a dream come true. And I want to say a big thank you to Olga, to Jeremy, to Christian, to Paul, and to Laura, who jumped in at the last minute. It's a privilege to be here. Now, even though I spent most of my career uptown at El Museo del Barrio, it began in the 80s in Soho, in a very extraordinary decade, which Lucy Lippard called the self-naming decade, and which Holland Cotter a few years ago stunned me in a panel in Houston by saying that he thought that that was one of the most exciting times he'd ever witnessed in the New York art world, and certainly so for his career. It was an exciting time of crafting collective agendas that had to do with social justice. They had to do the agendas with acknowledging difference, with asking questions, hard questions that broke cultural, ethnic, and racial barriers. From this time emerged a lot of new aesthetic languages, big ideas, and hybrid categories that are relevant to this day. And it had to do, as we delved deeper into questions that actually emerged in the 60s, if we're going to be clear about it, but it just brought just new ways of thinking, and in the end took us to our real goal, which was to recover the power to tell our own stories in our own ways. And we had heard through the great Uruguayan artist Torres Garcia had given us a way to go. And he said, our north is the south. And well, I think I'll stop there until I get to
when we get the different images.
To the different images.
So maybe one thing we can do as we make our way through some of the slides is maybe you could speak a little bit more about the altar form, Amalia, and you did several versions of the piece that's still up there, which was your ofrenda to the Mexican movie siren Dolores del Rio, and so that was the one that you did it at the Intar, right, which is Grotto of the Virgins, and it had many altares, and not just this one, but this was the final 1991 version, which is now up. And I think since it's become like a signature medium, installation medium for you, I think it'd be really interesting to hear about, for you, what is the power of the altar form as an installation, and how do you think of the difference between sacred work, sacred altars, and altars as art forms?
Well, I think it's really about the origin of it. In the early Chicana movement, I would say one of the great demands or driving forces was the concept of cultural reclamation. We were in a community that had been largely ignored. I was born in 1943, sort of like the Second World War. My father had come through from the Mexican Revolution. He was 3 years old when they came in 1917. My mother had come on a day pass in 1920 when she was about 3 or 4. Neither of them had papers. I grew up in an undocumented community, and I grew up in a community that was really fairly marginalized and isolated. I went to school, grammar school, in the 50s, late 40s, 50s, and it had just become possible for Mexicans and white students to actually be in the same school. So I was right on the cusp. And people never think of integration or segregation as occurring in the West, but it was. And the very earliest court battles on desegregation actually happened with the Mendez family, and it preceded the Board of Education, Brown and the Board of Education. So it's not, I think it's not a well-known story, and therefore I've always felt that our histories are a little bit vague for people because they're really in the shadows in a way. So I really grew up in a very particular way where my grandmother kept a home altar. My mother had been abandoned young and grew up in a Catholic orphanage school. So she was exposed to European images of the Virgin. So I didn't have Guadalupe other than through my grandmother. But those home altars, and this is a funny thing. This piece in the show is called The Altar for Dolores del Rio. It really literally should be called the Ofrenda for Dolores del Rio, because the altar is the permanent, ongoing home history. The ofrenda is a temporal, ephemeral, maybe 3 or 4 day process of evolution of the family's memories. And it extends out of the altar, but it goes away. So really, this is actually an ofrenda. But it's in common language, people just use altar because it's an American word. So I came into the movement actually pretty fairly grown. Luis Valdez and I, Teatro Campesino, were together in college, but I came into the Galería de la Raza from a place called Casa Hispana de Bellas Artes, which was doing the first Chicano shows to Delano. And I was already then probably in my mid to late 20s. So when I took up the role of altarista in my community, it was simply because I was familiar with it because of my grandmother, and everybody knew it because everyone had them in their families over time, in the kitchen, in the bedroom. And then for Days of the Dead, you know, unlike Mexico, we can go to graveyards. We couldn't spend the night and light the candles and sing and play music. Now I see that you can. I see it all over America. But in those days, that wasn't possible. So by the late 60s and early 70s, I'd entered into the movement and took on the role of the altar. And I want to say that I think that what helped me to move forward was the realization that I could experiment. My mentor is Yolanda Garfias Wu. She was Oaxaqueña, lived in San Francisco. She was my mentor as I learned about education, went into teaching with her. And she was, because of her Oaxaqueña background, very, very well placed in the whole tradition of ofrendas. She taught me all the ways to do it. We played around in the graveyards, went to visit our family in the graveyards, but in California, they weren't doing the ofrendas. Along the border, they still were. And she was one of the first people that was asked to come back to Mexico to help revitalize the waning interest of ofrendas in places like Guadalajara and Mexico City. So the altars have always been a sort of personal space for me because they're places of remembrance. And when I started Dolores del Rio, it was largely because of my mother. For many of the young people here, they won't know who she was. She was both an American and Mexican movie star. The American side, she played exotics. Madame Dewberry, Flame of Tahiti, and Flying Down the Rio with Fred Astaire, I think. And in the Mexican one, she was Maria Candelaria. She was in Day of the Dead movies, basically, La Abandonada. So making a space for a binational beauty, because she was so beautiful, was really important because at that point in time, we had no icons to look at. We had nothing that said to us that we were worthy or beautiful, cinematic. And so that's how she came into being. But I met her in 1983 because the San Francisco Film Festival did an homage to her and she came. We had Cine Acción, our own film group. We honored her. I met her. She was still equally as beautiful. She was older. She died almost that very next year in 84. The first one was 84. This one is 87 in Tar. And this one went to Europe and never came back. Who knows? It's probably it's in someone's front room. No, it's not. It's too big. It's in an airport in a crate somewhere. I don't really know. I never could find it and I never got it back. So when the Kata show came along and they wanted me to do it for 91, I thought, okay, I have to start all over again. So I recreated, and the one you see upstairs is actually an interpretation. 1, 2, 3. It's the fourth interpretation of Dolores. But I think that that's something that was my connection to Juan Bosa. It was my connection to many of the Caribbean artists because for the first time, I realized we weren't the only people that did this. And because my husband, Richard Baines, who's here, and I were very much involved in Asian societies because he's an ethnomusicologist, I learned deeply about Chinese and Japanese traditions and the reverence for the dead, the remembrance, the form of the altar, the celebrations to remember people at 40 days, at 80 days. I learned many, many things about other cultures to realize we are not alone in this. And I know when people come to my show, they may not be Latino, but I see them dabbing their eyes. They get a little verklempt, you know, they start remembering their own grandmothers, the people they've lost, the grief that they've endured. And that's what the altar's about. Really, that is.
Can I just add quickly add quickly that when this opened at Intar, and that's where I met you, yes. Intar was a tiny space on 42nd Street, yeah. And led by this fearless Cuban woman, Inverna López. And no one had ever seen anything like this show. Once it opened, the word went out, and it was full up all the time.
Thank you.
That's awesome. There were two other artists whose altars we included in the slideshow. We have one by Clara Lomas Garza, who's also really well known for papel picado cutouts. And then we have another one, which is Esther Hernandez's Sun Mad Raisins installation that was based on the print. And then later she turned it into an installation in honor of her father, yes, who had been a farm worker. And I think this is part of the work that was happening in the 80s, which I think we still have a lot of accounting to tell. So any thoughts about those artists and those works? And then also, Susana, we'd love to hear from some of the artists that were making work in New York in the 80s.
Well, you know, the whole concept of resistance and affirmation meant that simply Chicano art beginning in the 70s and actually going to present time, even though people use different terminologies, really rested on the idea of resistance to the discrimination, oppression that we face. And, you know, there was a time when we actually thought we could solve those problems, the issues at the border. And then as the years have passed, decades and decades, we found ourselves almost in full circle back again to those kinds of really divisive and I feel very frightening responses to immigration because we've never been able to solve the problem. So when Carmen Lomas Garza did this piece, this is for her grandfather, Antonio. She and I had met in the 70s when I was working on my very first homage at the Galeria de la Raza. She came in and she saw me sitting on the floor, cutting papel picado very badly, might I say. And she's the queen. And she said, "Let me help you." So she sat down and she taught me how to do it without, for those of you who don't cut paper, if you cut the wrong attachment, the whole thing falls apart. So you have to be really, really careful. And I was using a mat knife and doing it badly. So she trained me and taught me how to do it. And I had at that time making ofrendas with, I didn't have sugar skulls, so I was making soft sculptures because I had a whole background in fashion and fabric design. And she said, and this Frida, who is this Frida? So I told her who Frida Kahlo was. And that was the beginning of this deep friendship we have. And every once in a while, she'll be someone to say, and Amalia, my comadre, she taught me about Frida. And, you know, now you don't have to teach anybody about Frida. She's on your purse, she's on your sunglasses. She's probably on a shower curtain in your bathroom or something like that. But she and Esther Hernandez, who did the Sun Mad, are in that first generation in which we were using what other people might call popular culture. We were retrieving what is often referred to as the everyday or quotidian life of our communities. We were learning how to do the things our mothers had taught us, but in service of art, as opposed to decorating our houses. All of those abilities, those strands of living and making the best out of the least, because we were communities that were often impoverished. When I was born, my father was working in the fields as a ranch worker. My first house was a little cabin in a field. My first job was cutting apricots. I paid my way through college by working at a cannery every summer and partway into the fall. We lived that life. And the generations that have come after, because of immigration, have often started in the fields. And our job is always to keep moving people along. But Esther was a prime example of that. She was born in Delano, in one of those hot spots that people don't talk about, that has to do with the pesticides. And so Sun Mad is a reflection on that. I think 2 of her sisters have died of cancer. They were it's called a cancer hotspot. It has to do with the pesticides in the fields, the spraying. And people don't want you to wear a mask or gloves, because then the average person driving by who buys that fruit goes, why are they all? So they invent. They have scarves they wear. That's why they're all in hoodies. It helps cover their face, and also it keeps the sun off of you. So she did Sun Mad first as a poster in 85, and then later in 90s when her father died, she did this installation. And you can see on the floor the radio he took to the fields to play music, his hat that he always wore. So just like Carmen, these pieces are part of a memory. And these women have gone on to become very, very well-known artists. Judy Baca got the National Medal of the Arts this last year. She's had a retrospective. She's currently painting the walls of LACMA. And like she says, for a little brown girl from Pacoima, that's a pretty big thing. So I feel really lucky that these are the women who have been my comadres and kept me company for over 50 years. And we hold together even when we don't see each other that well, because this kind of work that we do is not about just art or art in the big white art world or art that you sell. It's now art that is collected, and I think that's an important step. We took a long time to accept that. We began in a system that we considered anti-elite. We were opposed to museums. We wanted to build cultural centers where our communities could find themselves, know themselves, be inspired, be emboldened, resilient. And then over time, for me, by the 80s, I crossed over into mainstream museums. And it was a total trauma, because I couldn't light candles. I couldn't put up pan dulce. I couldn't use live flowers. You see here my mosses and my potpourris and my lavender, all irradiated. I'm baking things in the oven at 150 degrees for 2 hours to kill every bug that could be living there, because we have collecting museums that cannot have living organisms possible there. But when we started, it was at home in our own centros. And when we started to cross over, there were many negotiations that had to be made. Some of the biggest ones were making it understandable to people. When you pass through the show in my Holy Communion piece in the first chapter of Venus Envy, I have a wall that has little postcard frames of Guadalupe. And I did that because I did that piece in 1993 at the Little Whitney in New York. And I remember thinking, no one is going to know what this is. I have to do something. So I used to call that wall Chicana 101. Then that way people coming in would get some idea, maybe they would ask about it. And so we did those adjustments. And I want to say that these women are also the same women that have led organizations in the way that Susana did. So there were leadership of women on both coasts. There was an exchange occasionally, largely because of the big national traveling shows in the multicultural decade, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, I really appreciate that emphasis, right, on the length of this effort, this struggle to incorporate Latinx artists and maybe even more, in so many cases, women artists. I'd love to hear more about that on the East Coast. Susana.
I was thinking, there is such a thing as the zeitgeist, and it was the time for all of these dialogues and preoccupations to happen, and the powers of our stories brought out lots and lots of shadows, people who had lived in the shadows, on the margins, people who, artists mainly, because the artists always lead the way. And the power of the stories, and here is one by Sophie Rivera. It's a photograph. She's a wonderful photographer and still has never received the merit she deserves. Here you have this shadowy figure. It's a self-portrait. She was very slight but always piled a lot of hair on top and against a chain link fence in such as you see in El Barrio. That's what parks are bordered by, or then they were. And I have always been inspired by Eduardo Galeano's quote about what the work that we were doing or trying to do. And as you said to me the other day, we didn't have categories or names or labels. We just were doing it. And Galeano says culture did not end for us in the production and consumption of books, pictures, symphonies, films, and plays. It did not even start there. By culture, we understood the creation of a place of common discovery among people. We wanted to talk to people, to give them once again their voice. Culture is communication, or it is nothing. And I don't think I ever had a conversation with Sophie. She was a totally silent person, but this is what she did, and she brought out so many astonishing thoughts with that beautiful image. The next shadow that emerged was completely in a different way, and it was in the hands of one of the great artists of our time, Pepón Osorio. And this shade that emerged from his life as he was going to marry his astonishing wife, who was a beautiful dancer, Merian Soto, and choreographer, he began thinking about his childhood and who were people that he wished she had met. And the person he most came upon was Juana Hernandez, who had actually raised him. And she was of African descent, just as Pepón is. But he realized that she too, in his own home, had been invisible to him and to his parents to a certain degree. And so he made this beautiful, extraordinarily beautifully crafted work in her honor. And now, as I've been sitting here thinking of the difference between altars, oh no, excuse me. Sorry, that is Maria Brito altar, right? So,
No, please continue with what you were going to say to Amalia.
well, because I was going to go to the altar of the Orishas, but of the next two slides.
Okay, let's see.
That one.
Okay, great.
But do you want?
No, this is perfect.
You tell me
Perfect.
how to.
Yeah.
You know, I've been thinking that this was a very, in 1985 at Mocha, Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art, which sadly only lasted 5 years. But it was.
But they were 5 great years. They really were. They were.
The first year
That's
we
their
did
mark.
32 exhibitions because we had 4 spaces, and every 8 weeks we'd put it up. And artists would bring, you know, there were no labels. I typed the labels in my home and brought them and stuck them on. And the artists always brought their works in the subway. I mean, it was a whole different world. That's how we could do 32 exhibitions. But we didn't know we couldn't do them. So this was a groundbreaking installation and a pioneering exploration of the theme of the fusion of African and Catholic images, the Santos and the Orishas. And this was Jorge Luis Rodriguez, a Puerto Rican sculptor. And he partnered with an Orisha initiate, Charles Abramson. And Robert Farris Thompson called this collaboration Brothers in the Santa Doble Fe. Doble Fe meaning that the camouflage that the Santos provided in the Catholic mainstream to really honor these African deities. They were absolutely joyful, as you could see. They had appropriate attributes, colors, votive offerings, and these were, originally worshipped in Nigeria and Benin, and later fused with Catholic saints for Santeria centers in Cuba, Brazil, Haiti, and Trinidad. But you see all the fabric hangings were the result of Jorge and Charles's dumpster diving in Soho. Soho then was still populated by sweatshops. And the next slide is just a reminder that this was the same year, 1985, when Andres Serrano did his Piss Christ. And it was like an earthquake. You all remember. Serrano was, you can imagine my surprise when I received this slide in the mail as a slide to look at from an artist who wanted to show with us. And we did give him a show called The Unknown Christ. And when I met him, a very soft-spoken gentleman, he said, he was so dead serious, and he was so totally misunderstood and received death threats, things. And he was exploring outright the extraordinarily, savagely cruel iconography of the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. It was that simple. But no one thought to ask him what he was doing with that work. And recently he said to me, the joy was in the struggle. And the struggle was serious because when the firemen came to inspect Mocha, they almost closed us down because the firemen were so offended by the work on the walls. Last. Oh, sorry.
It was Andres speaking from another place. I did.
Next, when people are under the oppression of colonialism, and I remind you, I'm from Puerto Rico, which is the longest living colony.
Yes, it is.
The escape, some forms of comfort and escape comes from what you have in Aztlán, which is the idea of an ideal place, a mythical place of origin that you can think of as still, that you can give you hope and in Puerto Rico we have no such myth of origin, but we have the shape of the island. And here, Rafael Ferrer from the 70s, a beautiful pastel that, of course, has the cruel truth, which is a fiction. And the indignities of being a colony, including our ex-president throwing paper towels at the people of Puerto Rico. It was just so unbelievable. But so those are thoughts on colonialism.
Yeah, incredible pieces. And I really appreciate that parallel between what Chicanos were doing on the West Coast, in finding like an alternative to their reality, right? To talk about Aztlán is like to say where we are is not properly home. So it's incredibly powerful. Amalia, what's up now, I think, is a good segue, is transparent migrations. It's an
Yeah,
incredibly
I
related
do want to
piece.
say something before I
Yeah.
talk about that. Some of the works that Susana has shown, particularly Pepón Osorio and others, these were people whose work I found such an affinity with that I finally realized that I needed to do something about it. So I began a series of curatorial projects, and I put together 2 shows, one called Ceremony of Memory, which began in 88, I think, and went till 91. And then another one called Ceremony of Spirit that overlapped from 91 to maybe like 93. And in both cases, I put together Chicano artists and Latino and Afro-Caribbean artists in the same show. Because one of the things I had discovered during the so-called multicultural decade is that people willing to give us shows and put us in these large shows, but only by our ethnicity, not by our conceptual or material or cultural meanings, because they didn't know what they were. So they just picked a lot of people with Latino last names, a whole group of Native Americans, a lot of African Americans, and then these big shows would travel. And we were not complaining because it would mean our works would get shown, but rarely were the curatorial premises deep enough for anyone to learn why we made this work. So when I did Ceremony of Memory, it was based on the concept that among both Chicano and Latino artists, and many others as well, memory is the link. It's kind of a bridge that you cross between the past and the present, and even has indicators for the future. So that memory, and my PhD is in psychology, so I had a special affinity for cognitive processes, and memory is one of them, voluntary and involuntary memory, personal memory, collective memory. So I use this as a way of organizing the show. And so I found that people like Pepón Osorio, with his memories of the Isla, and people like myself with our memories of our places that we grew up in, and not just about places, but memories of people, memories of traditions, and memories of history and struggle. So Aslan is one of those memories. Aslan, and this came to us in the 60s, the late 60s. It comes from the word Astitlan, which is the place of the herons. So it was the place that Mexicas began in the north, long before any colonial period. And so Aslan became this, we thought it was mythical, this mythical space in which we could think of our origins. Because one of the big jokes in Chicanos and Mexicanos is, we didn't cross the border crossed us. Everybody knows that one. It's just, we use it all the time because we became what are referred to by some theoreticians and scholars as internal colonials. So the US came up over us. And by us, I'm talking about 51.4% of Mexico's northern empire. So we're talking Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, California, and you just keep Utah part of all of it. It was huge. And imagine that it gets us the money, the gold, the trees, the oil, all that came with that. But the people were a bit of an impediment. So there was a Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which protected us. And in Article 10, they protected our right to language and culture. And for some people from an indigenous background, it protected the right of passage along the border. So Victor Zamudio Taylor, who I worked with for a number of years, was Pai Pai. And Pai Pais had the right to cross the border, no papers, nothing, because they lived. Your Odoms, your Tono Odoms, they got bifurcated in the midst. I mean, one of the saddest things to me recently is the realization that in the effort to build the border wall, which we all cackle over, it's like, what, 2,000 miles? I don't think you're going to make it. But one of the portions of the border wall goes through the Tono Odoms burial grounds. I mean, so there was no place that was safe and protected where we were living. We were seen as outsiders, foreigners, in my case, wetbacks, whatever you wanted to call it. And so finding the story of Aslan, this beautiful place, seemed to us like a gift. And so we began to write about it. We began to make artwork about it. And And often we were ridiculed by others because, like, what did we have to do with a Mesoamerican life? That was hundreds of years before. In some cases, thousands. Teotihuacan was 150 AD to 2 something AD. It was as big as Rome. It had the population of Athens. Teotihuacan, where you see the pyramid of the sun and the moon, the apartments of artists who came from all over the Americas to build those edifices. Well, how could we say that that was us? How could we say that that was where we came from? But we needed to do that. And so we began our way through Aztlán. There were Totecas de Aztlán in San Diego. There was a dance group. There were theaters of Aztlán. There were people who wrote poetry about Aztlán, and those of us who made art about it. And then, lo and behold, in 2000, I think, maybe 1999, 2000, Virginia Fields and Victor Smudio Taylor were organizing the first show called The Road to Aztlán at LACMA. And it was basically a show of archaeology and anthropology. It was basically a show that acknowledged the exchange of sacred objects in trade. And in that period of time, do we have a problem? No. Okay. No, I just didn't know.
We're making a racket.
No, it's just a little signs. And I thought, is it time? Is it too late? Is the hook coming? We joke about the hook all the time. In any event, this is my Aztlán. In that show, they decided to add a small section at the end of Chicano and Mexican artists who had dealt with that theme. I decided to make my Aztlán a sort of transparent migration because the road to Aztlán was a migratory pilgrimage of groups that were in the north and came to Mexico City. It was then the city on a lake, Tenochtitlan. It was described in some of the journals of the Spanish who arrived as this wondrous sight of this sparkling city that was as beautiful as the mosques and temples that they had ever seen. And in those days, I think before the onslaught, before the Spanish total occupation of Mexico, it was still one of the great cities of the world. So I made mine a path there. I wanted to have a field of maguey, but after paying for 2 cactuses, agave, to be blown, I realized I couldn't have 20 after all. So stick around. Maybe one day I'll get enough money to fill the rest in. But it is my home place. And that Aztlán, like the Isla, is that utopian sense of your origin, your safe place, and what bell hooks used to call the home place.
Mm-hmm. You know, that connection between history, which your work is like surfacing continually, like in an archaeological dig in a classic feminist way, right? Which is, you know, we don't have those histories, so how do we find them, right? Your work does that so much. And I think that while looking at the ancient past and surfacing that, you also have a way, it seems to me, to continually connect the issues of those hidden histories to the present realities. You have Sor Juana, for example, the Sor Juana Inés's desk, which has to do with the 17th century, and yet you have like this ticker tape, right?
My ticker tape I upgrade every time I do her. When I began it in the early 90s, it was the AIDS epidemic, a terrifying and traumatic moment in our history for those of us old enough to remember. We lost many, many, many great thinkers, writers, designers, artists, and friends and lovers. And so at the same time, the US was dealing with the dropout rates, primarily of Latino and Black students. So I have all those statistics. It was a period of time in which the populations of cities with Latino groups was rising. And then when I had to redo it for the new show, I had the COVID data. And the COVID data is pretty scary. Latinos are almost the highest group represented. That's a subset of it that died, in the millions that died. So it was
essential workers.
Essential workers. And I want to say these works, this Sor Juana and the next one we're looking at,
The Wunderkammer,
are really about historical investigation. So I moved through many parts of my life in the 50 years that I've been making things. First, of course, sacred rooms and altars and ofrendas, and then later into areas of historical investigation. I call them libraries and laboratories because that's sort of the way that I look. I pretend I'm a scientist and I'm examining things. I pretend many things when making these works. So which one are we on now?
So the next set of images that we had were actually moving back and looking at some of the work on the East Coast. And we also found some parallels there with the piraguas, or the fruit vending carts. And so...
I don't know whether this belongs in the Wunderkammer or...
It could have been in the
Wunderkammer of the future, right? Yeah.
But
and then there's this piece as well.
In addition to holding on, that in addition to holding on to mythical places of hope or that can give you hope in your despair, and there's also the reality of the culture. I've heard you tell many times of the cycle of affirmation and resistance. And I think the Puerto Rican path in the early years of arriving in New York City and creating a center of culture were very similar. The affirmation, and I think actually that is what has held Puerto Ricans together, is their fierce determination to preserve their own culture, their language, and even if they develop new languages like Spanglish, but it's all right because believe it or not, Spanglish also, it assumes and necessitates a very clear and correct use of language in both sides. To me, the piragua cart is just the most wonderful and funny symbol. This was found in the streets of El Barrio in the 70s, and we bought it from Edgar Ruiz Zapata, who was the piragüero. And again, it's just to me a beautiful, iconic symbol of our complete being fiercely defensive of our culture, and fighting back with resistance by attaching such importance to even the details of our culture. And I have to just one for a second. It's so typical this of Puerto Ricans. They take something like a baby carriage and they transform it and make it Puerto Rican. And it's just, Pepón Osorio had a taxi cab that he, made Puerto Rican taxi cab with all of his, and it went around New York in wonderful ways. And I'm joyful because the next generation of artists that is coming, and this is the great Miguel Luciano, and this work is from about 10 years ago, and it's called Pimp My Piragua, and it's just, fabulous transformations and reinventions of things that are rock bottom Puerto Rican.
Yeah, so cool. It's also bringing in performance and, it's,
absolutely, and social practice, very important, like Pepón also. The social practice of many, many young artists is really redeeming so many things. And, in a way, I thought of myself, well, this is like a mini lowrider for us.
And it does look like a lowrider, I have to say, like a lowrider crossed with a Volkswagen, But it does bring this theme of how I think in Latinx art of the U.S. you see like objects and themes that persist across generations, and I think until people begin to get it, they probably will keep on reappearing and being like refurbished, right, by younger generations. Here's another of these, parallels that you've both been talking about. Here is a piragua that would go by a different name that Judy Vaca did,
Yes.
which has a very funny name. Where is
Raspado, what's the next one?
Yeah, with raspados mojados.
Yes.
So it's a pun, right?
And
I love
mojados are wetback shoes.
Right.
It's like a slang name.
Like-
Raspado mojado.
Yeah, and then I think now we're segueing back into.
Can I take credit for the copper hubcaps?
Totally.
I did the copper hubcaps on Judy's Raspado
Oh,
mojado.
okay.
It was in a show called
art historians take note.
Yeah, it was in a show called Urban Revisions, and they were having all these architects, and none of them were Latino. So we staged an intervention. We went to the museum and spoke to them about what they were missing. So not to have us cause a scandal and a scene, they invited us to do an intervention. So we brought in our best graffiti writers, which really look like Arabic writing. They are so beautiful. And they did the walls up over the ceilings. Judy did the cart. I did a series of descansos, which are resting places. They're little bitty shrines that you see on the side of the road where someone dies in a car crash or gets hit by a car or dies in the field. So I did 10. They were called the resting places of Los Angeles because my mother and father lived part of their life there. And there was sort of an invisible line across the city. And you could only live on one side if you're white, and Mexicans were on the other side. And my mother and father, so innocent were they as young newlyweds, they tried to rent a little tiny, it was almost like a cabin on the wrong side of Wilshire Boulevard. Mm-hmm. And they went the day to sign the papers. And the real estate agent was very apologetic and said, "I'm really sorry, I can't rent to you. There's a petition in the neighborhood and they don't want any Mexicans living here." And it's actually a story that's a turning point in my own development. Because when I asked my mother years later, "Well, what did you do?" She said, "Oh, mija, we don't want to be around people that don't want us. Mal educados." That means, it doesn't mean badly educated as in formal education.
Badly brought up.
Yes, badly brought up. Mm-hmm. So she said, and my father agreed, they don't want to be there because these are not good people. And my response was, well, what? I learned first from my husband, Richard, to stand up. And then I became a Chicana. I thought, when people say, well, what does it mean to be Chicana? I said, well, it's sort of like someone who's not willing to accept the status quo, gets a little irritated, stands up, has to change it. And if they can't change it, they're going to make it real difficult for you to keep it the way it is. And that really, to me, it's a social practice. It's a consciousness. And people don't always use it. I think here it's not widely used. Mexican American might be, or Mexicano. And I don't care about the labels. I really care about how we manage to change the things that are not acceptable to us. So we did the intervention. It was very successful. Guillermo Gomez Penny arrived in his zebra suit and did an outrageous performance on the plaza in front. And they'll never do that again. That's the last invitation we ever got.
Very, very funny.
Well, thank you for that, Amalia. So I think now, as we're like at 2:05, I think we really just wanted to circle back to the present. We wanted to show you some images. This is an altar that Amalia made in 1995, Museum of Fatima, that became that was part of an exhibition that Susana curated at El Museo del Barrio last year. And it was an invitation, domesticanics with the X, to dialogue with Amalia's work and her thinking, her famous essay called Domesticana, in which she theorized how from a feminist perspective, Chicana artists operate with a making do with what's at hand, right? Using their own domestic bits and pieces. And this was one of the younger artists, Joel Gaitan. This is a close-up. It was a very queer and trans-focused exhibition, installation of his with these individual pieces. Here, La Flor Si, made in 2022. And we really wanted to, I think I'm going to leave it at this one, back at Amalia's work. And one of the things that we'd agreed would be nice to think about together with you, for Susana and Amalia to think about it's important to really be able to assess and appreciate and celebrate the gains that have been made in U.S. Latinx art, in its exhibitions, in its collection, in its recognition of artists, and its incorporation, and recognition as American art, or America's right hemispheric art. And so, wanted to ask both of you to address this, and also, in your view, like what remains for us to do. So both sides of this, what has been achieved that is so important for us to recognize and not take for granted, and where would be areas that you think we should all press, on further, especially for the coming generations, for the future. So please, we'd just love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about it because I'm in a moment now where my work is being recognized after, I would say, 50 years. I had shows, I've always had shows, but I always knew there was a glass ceiling and that I would probably never get past it. And yet things are changing. So when I thought back over it, I thought, well, the 70s was sort of the origin of the naming, autonymic, what you call yourself, Chicano. Exonymic, what others call you Hispanic. We never liked it, didn't make any sense because we weren't Spanish. And then there was this collective large-scale shows, and we thought those were great achievements. I remember when the Decade show came in the 90s, and the New Museum, Mocha, and Studio Museum all put forward artists. Then they mixed them all up, and we all in different museums. And it was really supposed to be about this new diverse moment. And then that ended, and we were right back where we started again. And then there was the Whitney Biennial, where they decided to try to, I think, at the museum, make a statement about diversity from a mainstream institution. And that exploded and actually caused much more damage than good that it did. Because we always call it, that's when the door slammed shut. So from 93 on, it was very difficult for diverse work to be shown. They went through a global art period because that was easier to bring in diversity from other parts of the world and not deal with homegrown issues. And then I think we came into the 2000s where we saw the rise of young curators, new scholarship. And I think of USLAF, it's the U.S. Latinx art form, where they now give fellowships. There's recognition, there's solo shows. To me, what is left is to make this not a 1 in 50 years event or 1 in 20 years event, but an event that happens regularly, that it opens up to so many artists, not just ones that make it to 80 or 110 or 101, Carmen Herrera, Luchito Hernandez, 99, Faith Ringo, Betty Saar, Lorraine O'Grady, all in their 80s and 90s. I'm 80. I'm the young chick in the group, I kind of really like it. It's the only place where I'm ever young. But I wish that could happen. And I think in order for that to happen, we have to have more curators, more diverse directors in museums, more diverse patronage and boards, more diverse scholarship. We need to have places where they can go to study and learn, and archives. We're losing a whole generation right now. They're leaving, they're dying off, and we're not capturing the historic breadth and depth of their experience and their knowledge. I just had my archive place at Stanford, and Richard negotiated that for me. But I made up my mind. I wanted it saved somewhere where I thought others could use it. And already, it's amazing. I get questions from people about a picture, and I said, "Where did you see that picture?" And they go, "Amalia, it's in your archive." And I, "Oh, that's right. Completely forgot." So I think, we're just on the cusp of actually maybe being comfortable with the kind of changes we're talking about. People have tried before. This is not something new. I remember standing before the Museum of Modern Art, 1989. I was invited by Reva Castleman, the chief curator, to organize an event called A Generation Apart. Apart from what? And so I had everybody I could find, Inverna Lopez, Conchessa Conwell, Luis Jimenez, Lorna Simpson, everybody, a whole day of panels. They announced at the end that this is such a wonderful thing. The museum director claims it. We're going to move forward. And 5 years later, all gone. Nobody remembered it anymore. So this time I'm hoping it's real and lasting. That's all I care, that it would be lasting. So the ones coming after us will have a chance.
Thank you for that, Amalia. That makes so much sense. There's a lot of work to do, and it's exciting. Susana, I wonder if you could share your thoughts as well.
I wish I could be as positive and hopeful as Amalia is. I remember in the 70s having an appointment with the director of the Met, with Lowry Sims, and I asked for an appointment with him to discuss diversity. This was in the 70s. And I remember he sat down and he said, "What is diversity?" So I have no more.
Okay, we're lost.
No. The protests then were quite. Remember when Benny Andrews arrived at the Met and he opened up a box of cockroaches. Do you remember? Yes, there was a lot. The art world was much worse behaved then than now. But what I have faith is the young people coming into the field. They are fearless. They are the ones who want to be professors now speak 3 or 4 languages. The ones who are artists they are global in their vision and in their research. So that's where my faith is, because I have no doubt, like as in this museum, this great museum, there are pipelines being established now that come from recognition in the staffs and in the management of the real talent and real intelligence that's coming up those pipelines. And that's where I think is my hope, because it is real. The young people coming up as curators, and they are being hired more and more.
Thank you, Susana. It's been such a privilege to sit here with these 2 amazing pioneers, pioneras. I mean, these are our living treasures, women warriors, and it's really a great honor to be here with you. I know that there must be questions and comments from the audience. We have another 15 minutes, and so if you could make your questions brief, that would be amazing, and that would allow more questions from everyone. So please, any questions from the audience? I don't know if we have microphones for people in the audience. Awesome. Great.
Thank you. This was a really beautiful trip to the past, present, future, and all the temporalities which are not linear. I wanted to ask about the notion of Nepantla that has been so important, especially thinking of a writer such as Gloria Anzaldúa. And for me, the notion of Nepantla has been nearly probably as prominent and become more prominent as we move along than Aslan, because it is this, is encompassing the complexity of living in a border and living in a place that is uncomfortable but fruitful and so forth. And I think your work really embodies that in a powerful way. So I would like to ask you if that's an important concept for you.
Nepantla came along later in my life. Gloria Anzaldúa and I knew each other. We did a panel together once at Williams College, and I read her work as all people in my community did. And people like, I'm trying to think of the artists, Irene Cervantes did some really beautiful pieces. Nepantla is for me like the concept of an interstice, a space in between. And it's helpful. It began around the border and also about racial identities, because Gloria would often talk about being Mexican and being Indian. So it's about borders, about spaces. And I think it has had a transformative way of answering questions about sexuality and gender, particularly in the generations now. The whole question of the X and Latinx began as really a question about fluidity, the trans communities, and then it sort of got morphed into Latin American versus Latino. So Latinx now is referring often to simply Latin artists in the US. But I think Nepantla is much more ample. I think that allows for all these different spaces to occur. And Gloria was one of the greatest that we ever had. And unfortunately, she died relatively young. So I don't use it directly in my work, but it is part of my thinking. And at times, I think, without meaning to, I actually create aspects of Nepantlas in my spaces. And I want to say that today, a lot of what we talked about has to do with not just art, but politics and social practice and culture. But in the end, that always goes back to the making, why we make things, who we make them for, and the ways in which we can see the world differently than what we are inheriting. Because the world we're inheriting for young people now is pretty scary. And without art, without the transformative powers of art, how can we believe that we will survive this? Now, I talked yesterday about healing across borders, not just US borders, but borders around the world. We are in an era of total rupture and displacement in so many lives and so many cultures. And if we don't have art, and by that I don't mean just the visual arts, if we don't have writers and we don't have scholars and we don't have poets and we don't have dancers and musicians, how will we live? I mean, that's the way that we are lifted up in our spirits and our souls. I said to the students yesterday when I was giving the tour, that making art rests in both the brain and the heart. You have to think, conceptualize. I research, some people don't, but I like to. But ultimately, I have to believe it. I have to care about it. If my heart doesn't open, no one else's will when they see it. So, I mean, I think that Nepantla is that space that we allow ourselves for the contentiousness and sometimes for the fluidity in which things that seem so different can really be together.
Thank you, Amalia. Thank you for the question. Other questions? Please.
I identify as a Chicana artist.
Can we get a microphone to the front, please?
Chicana exhibition.
Yes.
So, it's always inspired me.
Thank you, Martin.
Phoenix gave birth to SB 1070, and which kind of created this alienation, right? And the treatment of campesinos and migrants. And I just wanted to ask you about the social commentary that's necessary, right, when we create artwork. You do this, right? And you do it so beautifully, right? Make statements when necessary. Apuntar el dedo, right? To point the finger when necessary. And I especially for young artists, how important this is, you know, for them to do the same.
Yeah, this is something, you know, I was head of an art program called Visual and Public Art at Cal State University, Monterey Bay. And we tried to build a program to teach students the things we had to learn after we got out of art school, because it didn't teach us anything other than maybe how to make things or how to think about what we were making. But what we learned is that making art all alone doesn't really last very long. And more importantly, you have to know where you want that art to go. So when we had to develop a program, we had to talk about research, we had to talk about community and collaboration, and we had to talk about production and distribution. We had to teach them, if you want people to look at your work, maybe you have to go talk to the library, or maybe you find a cafe, or maybe you and a group of people rent a space for a month and put your work up and go and hand out, flyers, or now use the internet. We came to the realization that artists have to be able not just to make work, but to talk about work, to build curriculum for their work, to find the people who will collaborate with them to make the work even greater and richer. The days of the 19th century model of an artist alone in a garret, suffering, dying, and then getting famous are all over. With the internet, you can be famous in about a week. I mean, it doesn't take much. And so I think we have now, with these kinds of social structures and media, ways of amplifying the voices that we represent and the voices that we share. And I totally am in favor of artists learning to write and speak. It's always been thought that if you make art, you really don't have the same skills to talk about it because you have only one form of communication, and that's the artwork. And I've never believed that. I think we have to be able to practically do it all. And maybe that's the generation I'm from, where there wasn't anyone else to talk about it or write about it other than you. I became a scholar by accident. I mean, I write about art, and I don't even have a PhD in art history. I have a PhD in clinical psychology, and I got that because I taught school. And I couldn't teach school because the kids were so disturbed and upset all the time. Some of my first groups that I ran were in the projects in San Francisco, which were just hell on earth. And I had to help mothers because they couldn't even survive in those places. So I ended up getting a PhD in clinical psychology to survive and to help other people survive. That's what Pepone Sordi and I had in common. He was a social worker. Yes. We always talk about the fact that that's what makes us do the kind of strange work we do. And our work doesn't fit into any categories. So yes, we should be talking about it. And we should have places that people can talk about it. And we don't make that easy for people. People come into museums and they get kind of quiet and they're not sure what they should ask or where they should go. Long ago, we had to talk to a group of museum directors. It was extremely unpleasant because they didn't want to hear from it. And I was talking about Latino culture and communication systems. So when a Spanish-speaking person meets another, and you don't have to be fluent, but you say, a sus órdenes, I'm at your service. Or encantada, I'm enchanted to meet you. When English-speaking people meet each other, they rarely say, I'm enchanted, or tell me what you want. A sus órdenes. No, language carries with it messages of culture, of welcome and of embrace. And so I said to them, it's very simple. You just have to train a bunch of docents who can say, a sus órdenes, bienvenidos, y encantada. And then you got them right there. They're gonna come right in. They feel really welcome. They didn't think it was a good idea, so I didn't try that again.
Great idea, though. I think we have time for one more question.
We have a lot of shy people.
And, maybe there's just a statement. Yeah, there we go. Right in the back. While the microphone is going to the next person, following up with what Amalia said, I just want to take advantage to once again thank the Phoenix Art Museum and its director, Jeremy, who's right there, and Olga Viso, the chief curator. We really want to thank you for making this show possible, making this conversation possible, making the series of events and the interviews and the documentation that you're doing here possible. It's an incredible thing when you make one exhibition. It needs to travel, and I think your generosity and your interest helped other organizations to take on this historic show. And we hope that many, many more will come with directors and curators such as yourself. So let's give them a round and then we'll continue. Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience. And the next question, please.
So I actually had a question around the term Chicano. It was used a lot during the panel. And I wanted to ask if you see any connections with the younger generation nowadays, because there's a lot of individuals that came to the United States at a very young age who don't necessarily identify as Mexican because they were never in Mexico. They aren't necessarily Mexican American, so they have that struggle of whether am I Chicano, am I not Chicano? A lot of us use the term dreamers. Do you see any connections of when the term Chicano came to popularization and in in the term like dreamers now, or a new term being used for the community that identifies as like, you know, we're not Mexican because we've never been to Mexico. We left when we were young, but we're not necessarily American because we're not, you know, fully like identified as American.
Well, I have to say for myself, I experienced that. You know, I was born in the United States. My parents came when they were very young, no papers. I'd never been to Mexico, and I remember even being in grade school and the teachers telling me to fill out this form and where are your parents born. So I didn't know if I should write Mexico because I knew that wasn't safe. And then she would come along and say, oh, honey, you know you're American. You just put U.S. So I would write U.S. with my fingers crossed, feeling as though I hadn't lied. And then I would go home and ask my mother for the 100th time, Mom, am I Mexican? Of course you are, mija. And I said, so I was born in Mexico? No, you know you were born in America. I said, am I American? Yes. So I'd go around spinning in my head thinking, what? And I never was fish nor fowl all those years until I was in my late 20s. And I came to the Casa Hispana de Bellas Artes until I met Yolanda Garfield-Swoo, until Carmen Lomas Garza came into my life. And we all sat around talking about what it meant to be Chicanas. And that's when I knew I finally found the place that was my own. And even now, people will say to me, why do you use that term? You know, you're an international artist. You can say this or that. I said, of course I can say that. And that's not untrue. And I'm an American artist, and that's not untrue. But if you want me to know who I think I am a Chicana. And that means that I'll go to the grave fighting over things that other people think aren't that important. But I think, wait a minute, that's not acceptable. So we used to have a slogan that was like, when people would say, well, what is a Chicana? And we'd say, it's a Mexican waiting to happen. What it meant was, you think you're Mexican and you get here and you have all the pride of being Mexican, and perhaps you even been in a dominant culture because you were Mexican. Then you get here, and the first time they insult you, the first time they won't wait on you, the first time they ignore you, you turn into a Chicana like that, because you know you have to say something, or you're going to spend your life with somebody's foot on your neck, and you're not going to have it. So I don't think it matters where you're born. I don't think it matters what generation you're in. It's cyclical. For a long time, it was like, oh, no, we didn't use that word anymore. Chon Noriega tried to do a show post-Chicano. I called him and I said, are you implying that we're all dead? What the hell is that? And he says, now, Amalia, don't get oversensitive. I said, I'm not being oversensitive. I just think you're being ridiculous, because Chicanos are a set of beliefs, and in the art world, there's certain thematic materials. And sure enough, in his show, there was immigration, there was place, there was family, there was memory, there was spirituality. It was a Chicano show, and I don't care what he called it. And so, you know, it's your choice to use the term or not. But I think in this age, it's quite a defining term, and people have to choose. You know, we were talking earlier about autonymic, self-defining names, or exonymic. I don't let people give me a name. I give myself a name. And I think that we have that choice in this country to call ourselves as we choose. So go for it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Susana, please.
May I offer some Puerto Rican variations on this subject? Because, first of all, when the Puerto Ricans arrived to go to the army, they were supposed to check black, white, and they added a box that said other, because they refused to be pinned down by their race. And then, how wonderful is New Yorican?
Yes.
How wonderful is it, really? And Boricua, which comes from our Taino ancestors. And in general, you know, it's just, nomenclature is so fabulous. Yes. And you have to keep up with it, because there's a reason when it changes.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation.